Hi Claire, I'm Gemma. I'm co-founder of Shook with Damon Stack, creative comms agency that we set up in 2020. I sit on the strategy side of things, looking after behaviour design. Damon looks after creativity, and we use the two things together to make ideas that shake the world.
Thank you. Thanks so much for being on the podcast today, Gemma. I would love to hear your story about how you got interested in this whole subject area.
Yeah, so to cut a long story short, when I was at Mischief, we had a brief on Dulux, which was a category change brief. So we looked for different ways to approach it. And I happened across BJ Fogg's work on the internet. It went really well in terms of answering that brief. We then used it when Damon and I won the first ever creative shootout to answer a charity brief. And I then was put forward by Frankie Corey for a WACL Future Leaders bursary. And I was always going to choose going and studying with BJ Fogg. Some people do a mini MBA, some people do the RADA presentation course, but I knew that I was going to use mine to travel thousands of miles across the Atlantic to meet a man that I found on the internet.
And you said it was a life-changing experience for you. Tell me more about it.
Absolutely. I can't sort of overstate enough. Like, I don't think I have a lot of those life-changing experiences that you hear people talking about on Desert Island Discs, like a teacher or whatever. But sitting in that classroom and learning from him directly genuinely blew my mind. And by that point, I've been in the industry for about 20 years. And I was sitting there thinking, hang on, there's loads of stuff that I've been getting completely wrong. And the way that we think about it and approach it as an industry just isn't actually how real people work. And I did check with him, does this mean we don't need creativity? And he said, absolutely not. We need creativity more than ever. But what it did was change how I thought about how we approach that creativity.
And you apply this creativity to briefs, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Tell me about how you apply it at the agency at Shook.
Yeah, so in terms of the actual agency, when we set up, we thought, well, we better practice what we preach. So we have habits and behaviours embedded into the agency culture. And the ones that I guess are most famous are, we have 3 habits that we ask everyone to do every day. The first is, when you get to work in the morning, say it's going to be a great day. And we even do that at our weekly meeting. We say it's going to be a great week. Then when you open your laptop, send one interesting thing to a colleague or a client. And that habit is all about having that broad creative palette. So knowing lots of interesting things, being useful to clients, keeping on top of the news agenda, maybe coming up with newsjacking ideas, but most importantly is about that palette of things that you've got to draw from, because that's what creativity is, after all, is putting 2 things together that weren't together before. And the more stuff that you've got to draw on in that palette, the better. And then the third habit is, what did you shake today? And at the end of every day, you've got to share on Slack, what did you shake today? We did it even when it was just 2 of us, me and Damo. Now, there's a few reasons why we do that. The first is, we've obviously got quite big goals and ambitions for our clients and for us as an agency. And that doesn't always happen overnight. So that lets us have a little snapshot of progress along the way. Another reason that it's really good is, sometimes you might have a shitty day. Unfortunately, sometimes we all have shitty days, and you can find something good in every day, even if it's been a shitty one. So it helps to remind you of that. And then finally, actually, we didn't mean it to do this, but you can also see like how people are. So if someone isn't doing it for a couple of days, like, are you okay? Are you too busy? Do you need support? It's really helpful from that point of view too. It's also really fun because at the end of the year, we go through them all and we pick out the best ones and spend an hour going through them. Some of them we can't even remember what they were and why they were so funny at the time. Others we laugh a lot about, and then we pick our favourite from the year.
I love that idea of celebration. We were talking about that, and that's one of BJ Fogg's really important points about setting habits, is that idea of celebration, and that the daily celebration somehow gives you then milestones for a weekly, monthly, annual target. In a way, it's very much more about things being a destination, and not being about the destination, but being about the journey. And I really love that.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you've either read his book, Tiny Habits, or you've trained with him, one of the things that you will know is that it's celebration or a feeling of success, which is actually what gets something to stick. So it's not the myth of doing it for 21 days or promising yourself a reward or promising yourself a punishment if you don't stick to it. It's actually that feeling of success, which is why he has tiny habits, because you start really, really small and then you can feel that feeling of success and that habit becomes embedded, and then actually you start to see yourself differently as a person, and therefore that behavior grows.
In terms of client work, can you give me any more examples of how you've applied it in your client work?
Yeah, really, like 10 seconds on behavior design. The things that you think about are whether you can change the context, motivation, ability, which is making things easier, and prompt. Now, most marketers start with motivation. Actually, BJ Fogg says you always tackle that last. You start with context and making things easier. And we will look at a client brief through those 4 levers, and sometimes it's one of them and sometimes it's a combination of them, but that helps us to come to the strategy and the creative idea. So I'll give you a couple of examples of that. So one, which I think we're quite well known for, was for a charity called Adult Cerebral Palsy Hub. They wanted care parity for people with cerebral palsy. The cerebral palsy community told us they were tired and in pain from trying to make their voices heard and getting fair healthcare like people with other lifelong health conditions get. And the client had been doing all the right stuff, so rational reports, trying to speak to politicians, and everyone was ignoring them. When we read the report, we were like, hang on, this feels like it should be illegal. People with CP are being treated like second-class citizens. And it gave us the creative idea of making a set of mock second-class citizen stamps, which generously people like Rosie Jones and Lost Voice Guy gave their images to. And our ask, we said, was so easy, so simple that it could go onto the back of that postage stamp, care parity for CP. That idea meant that we made a media furore, and we also got the attention of ministers, and we ended up getting an all-party parliamentary group for care parity for CP. But what was brilliant about it was it gave the community a really easy way to make their voices heard and a really easy way for politicians to understand what the problem was and how they could help to solve it.
Thank you. Yeah, you're making me think about the government, the UK government, or now Nesta's nudge unit, which was set up, and perhaps people will know from COVID, which that whole piece about nudging people. You're talking about ease, but just being able to use different ways and influences to get people to do something. In that case, to get the vaccine. I think it's really interesting to hear about it used in the context of a lobbying, what you might consider almost maybe a more corporate campaign as well, that real sort of behavioral economics combined with the creativity in that healthcare space.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, more widely, right, creativity is never a bad thing. So we are fundamentally a creative consumer agency. That's the background that we've come from, but we do some work that goes into charities and campaigning organisations. We've done some work for corporates as well. And creativity is only ever going to make any of that work better, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it's, for us, it's a really interesting way to think about what the problem is. So one of the things that people will often do is if they want to do a behaviour, they will think about it as like an aspiration, like get fit, rather than be specific about what that actually looks like, i.e. go to the gym 3 times a week for 20 minutes after work. And if you think about client briefs, quite often that's the same. They've got these really broad objectives, but they're not actually specific about the audience and the behaviour that we want that audience to do. So it just helps us to get a little bit more specific about what the problem is. And I think that's always a much easier way to get to a good creative idea as well, is being specific about what the problem is.
Yeah, absolutely. It's being specific. And as you said, you talked about definition of creativity earlier, which was about combinational creativity and joining things, problem solving and being creative in the way that you solve problems. You need to be clear on what the problem is to start with, don't you? And that's, like you say, a big thing then broken down can be really helpful. Someone said to me on the podcast recently, you have to fall in love with the problem before you can fall in love with the solution. And that sounds like a really great way to start getting more granular about that. If anyone listening today thinks, oh, this is really interesting, I don't know where to start, how would you give someone a tip on how to get started in this area?
So I would say the easiest way to do it is think about what you want to do and then think about how you can make it really, really small to start off with. So if you take the Tiny Habits recipe, that's easy to remember. It's ABC, it's anchor, behavior, celebration, because of what I've just talked about success. Let's say your habit is you want to be more creative, right? So I would say, okay, let's assume you work in the industry. Every morning you're reading news in some form, whether it's the paper or it's on social media. Pick one thing that you've seen that morning and come up with an idea. And then, you've had an idea, so you're probably going to feel good naturally, but, do a high five, fist pump, smile yourself in the mirror, whatever, to make yourself feel successful. And then keep doing that every day. And I think it's just quite fun. Like we were joking about with that Peppa Pig the Peppa Pig's mum's pregnant story the other week, like doing our newsreads, and obviously that was kind of the big story of the day, right? What would we do next? And I was like really pleased with myself because I said release the Parma Sutra, and that's how Mummy and Daddy Pig got into that position. Not necessarily the best idea, but it's just fun getting into that habit of coming up with ideas every day. And like I used to work with Simon Moore at Mischief, and he was always like, I just need to have one good idea a day. I did that creative profiling once where my creative profile is the full, which means you just come up with a lot of ideas and you're just happy to have a lot of ideas and see what sticks. And I was thinking this morning before doing this, I would say I've had a good 5 ideas already this morning in all sorts of different ways. And it's really important to just keep having ideas. And I think we were talking earlier about it's better to have ideas full stop, and then you can get to the good ones. Like a writer would say, you need to do a bad first draft.
Yeah, absolutely. And writers and script writers in particular, also, they don't judge their ideas as they're having them. So I work with quite a lot of script writers and people that work in that field, and they're looking for proliferation of ideas, and they just call it material, and they don't judge it as good or bad until they decide the job that it has to do.
So I think it's Nora Ephron that says everything is copy. And you were talking earlier about gratitude journaling and then journaling more widely. And like one of the things I've been trying to do lately is, I said to you, I've been trying to write more and write poetry and be in poetry slams. And I read this book that was recommended by the poet Mike Gary, who's amazing, by the way, which is about how to write better. And one of the things is about just having a notebook where you just note down stuff that you see. So on my phone, I've just got loads of like couple of keywords or like something I overheard somebody say or something I realised, and I might not do anything with them for a while, but it is kind of just spotting those interesting things or those patterns or those trends that you know that there's something that you can make more of.
Yeah, I heard Paloma Faith talking about exactly the same thing on the radio the other day, and she was saying that that's how she gets her ideas. She sits on the tube and she'll listen to someone say something, and actually once you tune into that, the things that you hear sometimes people saying on the tube, on the train, or wherever you are so outrageous sometimes and so bonkers that you think no one would believe that if you actually said that you'd sort of heard a snip of it somewhere.
I know. I also think there's nothing funnier than real people either. And sometimes when I think marketers like don't think about the audience as real people, and they are funnier and messier and weirder and all those things, because they're people that we know, but they're not the same as the people that we see written in a pen portrait on a PowerPoint slide.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that sums up our conversation really nicely in the sense that so much of the creative process is messy. It's not this straight line. It's not this sort of like we're going off in this. It like we were talking earlier, it's the sweat, it's the grunt, it's the grit, it's the hard work to get something somewhere. But something like this BJ Fogg's Tiny Habits or behavioral science can at least help us to start to make some sense of the mess.
Yes. And I think there's lots of reasons why I was drawn to his work, but one of them is just that it works for everybody. Often we'll all be working across markets and across different cultures, but this really looks at like fundamental human truths, and it can give you it doesn't mean everybody's the same, and it doesn't mean there's only one answer, but it starts you from a point of really understanding like what makes humans do what humans do, and knowing that they are, maybe a little bit irrational, trying to think about the best way to organise it. And I liked it because I find it really simple and a really useful model to work through.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much, Gemma. Thanks for being on the podcast and sharing everything about Shook, how you're working and what you're shaking.
Well, you're welcome. It was a pleasure. It's always a joy to talk to you, Claire, and I love talking about creativity.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Now Go Create. I hope you enjoyed the conversation on how to upskill and unleash your creativity at work. Check out the free downloadable worksheet for this episode on my website, nowgocreate.co.uk. And if you like the episode, please be sure to subscribe to our show and follow us on social media at Now Go Create. Now, go create.